Well, welcome back to the Seattle's Eastside Real Estate Podcast. I'm Dan Edwards, your host with the Eastside Real Estate team, and we are going to welcome to the show Ann Bryant. So let me pop her onto the stream here. And Ann P. Bryant, Esquire, right? Is that how you say it as an attorney?
Yes, if you're fancy.
If I'm trying to be fancy, I like that. Graduated from Roger Williams University School of Law, where she was a staff writer for Law Review and the secretary of the Women's Law Society, and was a New York pro bono scholar, jurisprudence scholar, and a public interest scholar. That sounds really scholarly. Prior to establishing Bryant Law, Ann clerked for the U.S. District Court in the Western District of Washington and has worked as a staff attorney for the Urban Justice Center, which is a nonprofit. I'll move this over here so I actually read it a little better. A nonprofit law firm in New York City. Continuing education is super important to Ann, who has completed hundreds of hours of estate planning specific education courses and is licensed to practice in Washington and New York City. Thanks for joining us, Ann.
Thanks for having me. I'm sorry, lawyers are known to be wordy, so
yeah. Well, just so you know, that is not the wordiest intro I've ever read. Just to be clear.
Good.
So great job. All right. So let's. We're going to talk about estate planning, and the topic is it's not only for rich people, right? That's a myth. So let's get into question number one. What is an estate plan?
An estate plan is essentially a plan that you have in case of an emergency, like a serious medical emergency or death. When you start going down the rabbit hole, you start thinking of all the questions that need to be answered. If you're in a coma or if you die, who's going to watch my kids? Who's going to pay all my bills? All of these things, who's going to handle it? An estate plan answers all of those questions, and it's more than just a will or a trust. It includes powers of attorney and living wills and just all the documents you need to make sure you're planning for the unexpected.
Now, most of the time I run into people in my instance where I'll get a call from a CPA or I'll get a call from another friend saying, hey, they need a valuation on a home and there's some debts and they can't sell the home yet because it's in probate. And I don't think a lot of people understand that, but as I understand, planning and a will can help prevent or avoid probate. Is that correct?
In some cases, yes. Most of the time, a will does not help you avoid probate. The only sure way to avoid probate is by using a revocable living trust. There's various types of trusts, so we're not really going to get into all the details of different types of trusts, but the trust is the best way to avoid probate altogether.
And why is probate such a bad thing? Why do we want to avoid it?
It's expensive, so you have to hire an attorney. You have to hire appraisers to get everything evaluated. There are court costs. And then there's the time. So, the average probate case, I would say, takes at least 3 months. It can be longer if it's tied up in litigation. So, you're spending a lot more money, or your estate would be spending a lot more money than if you had spent a little extra money up front to get a trust. And the other great thing about a trust is that any assets that are in the trust are available sooner to your beneficiaries. So if you're leaving behind a spouse or some kids that really need to be able to access these assets, having a trust rather than a will would help bypass this lengthy and really expensive probate process.
Okay. So it's a matter of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, at least.
Okay. At least. Okay. At least. Okay. So let's talk about if somebody doesn't have a will, what happens when they die?
Well, the state gets to decide what happens. So in a lot of cases, your assets will pass to your spouse and your kids. If that is not, if there's a blended family or if you don't have kids or a spouse, the state is going to decide who your assets go to. The state would also be the one to decide who would make decisions for you if you weren't able to make decisions on your own behalf. For some people, this is a perfectly acceptable solution, but for a lot of people, they would rather make sure that assets are going to their kids in the way that they want, how and when they want.
So I'm super confused. I mean, so even if I have heirs, yet I don't
Mhm.
have a written will of any kind, the state gets to
Mhm.
decide what happens with my inheritance.
Yes.
Wow.
And especially in blended family situations that can get convoluted. So it's really
Right.
important to take the reins into your own hands.
Gotcha. All right. So as you know, I'm fairly young and healthy. Why should I get an
Mhm.
estate plan?
Well, you are young and healthy, but anything can happen to any of us at any time. Um, it's not just death we're planning for. We're also planning for potential emergencies, serious illnesses where you might be in and out of the hospital. Um, there's also asset protection that you can do with setting up an estate plan in advance that you can't do if you wait too long.
Okay. I think that it's always you. It's almost like, what's that saying? It's like you either fail to plan or you plan to fail. And this is
Mhm.
kind of like that same instance where when you don't put a plan together, you're certainly planning to fail in this specific instance.
Yes.
All right. So why do I need a will if I'm married? I obviously just said that with regards to the spouse getting everything. If you don't have a will, basically the state steps in because there may be I remember from my real estate training talk about a will being like verbal, like that's a
Mhm.
possibility, or written on just a piece of paper, like a back of a napkin and stuff like that. Those all could be valid. And so my assumption is that that's why the state steps in. It just seems crazy that the state would step in if you didn't do something. If you didn't do something, it's just like tough. It's going to probate. That's what probate is, right?
Yes, and the importance of it. So even if everything is going to go to your spouse and you're 100% positive of that, there can still be a delay in the assets if everything is titled into one of the spouse's name. I have a client like this right now who her husband passed away and they didn't have a will. She ended up having to borrow money from people because she couldn't access the retirement plan that was wholly in his name. And she was going to get it eventually, but it put her in a really tough spot in the beginning because she didn't have the proper documentation in place.
Oh, I see. I see. So, so I have a funny story. Just full disclosure, Anne is currently working on my estate plan right now, and so we were discussing inheritance, and my wife and I really hadn't had that conversation. So I posed the question to my son yesterday. This is so funny, Anne. I go, "Hey, so let's say you get $1 million. Somehow you fall into $1 million. What would you do with it?" And he's like, "Well, I guess I come see you and ask you what I should do." And I was like, "Okay, well, let's just say I'm not available." He's like, "Okay, well, then I go ask mom." I was like, "Okay, well, let's just say mom's not available." He's like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "Well, okay, well, just what would you do?" He's like, "Well, I'd probably go over and ask Mrs. Neal what to do." So it was just so funny, right? Which leads me to my next question is like, how do we make sure, right, a kid doesn't blow their entire inheritance? Because we were talking about in the event that I were to pass away and my life insurance pays out. So how do we, what are some ways you go about making sure that, young kid who's brand new in life, who gets a windfall inheritance doesn't just blow it?
Well, the best way is to set up a trust for them. So whether you have a lifetime trust or a will, you can create a trust for your kids if something happens to you. And in that trust, you can set boundaries and age limits on when and how much they can access of the trust assets. You can put incentives on there, like, for instance, having them finish college. You can grant them access for specific uses, like buying a house or down payment for a house. So it's just a really great tool to both protect your kids from themselves and also ensure that they are learning, good financial practices.
Good financial life.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's see, what else can we cover? Oh yeah. So Washington State has a death tax. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So
Uh,
what is that? How does that work?
so a death tax is kind of like it sounds. If you paid income tax your whole life and then you die and there is another tax, but it's only for individuals who have over 2.2 million. A lot of people don't realize that Washington has a death tax that's separate from the federal tax. The Washington death tax is any amount you own over 2.2 million at your death will be taxed. There's a variable rate, and there's ways to avoid it, but in Washington, it's pretty easy these days with home prices and high earners, and sometimes life insurance is included in the total value of your estate. So there are a lot of people who may not consider themselves particularly wealthy, but they may end up be paying this death tax when they pass away anyway.
I see. Okay. When we talk about death tax, we talk about asset protection. So what's the difference, and how does asset protection help you minimize the amount of taxes you're having to pay?
Asset protection is, there's a specific type of trust that we use to avoid paying a tax, or that would be more of a tax planning mechanism. Asset protection is more getting your assets protected from creditors and any potential bankruptcy or potentially a future spouse. So a common planning mechanism is to create a marital asset protection trust so that if one spouse passes away, you can protect half of the assets, both from potential creditors, but also if that spouse later remarries, it preserves the family money for the kids in that situation. And it also can protect, if you leave money to your kids or assets to your kids in a trust, it can protect their assets from creditors as well. So you are essentially creating some wealth for your child that is protected from creditors and their potential future spouses as well.
Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot to this estate planning kind of stuff. And a lot of, like you said, education, right, which you've been doing. What got you so passionate about providing this service to people?
I really like working with individuals and helping them plan for the future. I joke with my clients, and as Dan, you've experienced, my job is to be paranoid for you, to think of all of the different ways that things could go wrong, the various scenarios that could come up, and make a good plan for those. So most of my clients at the end of the day, after they sign their documents, tell me that they feel a lot more relaxed and a lot more peace of mind. And one of my clients even joked that he was going to go out and do something dangerous now. Because
I was going to say, ready for skydiving, ready for, get the motorcycle. Yeah, live a little more dangerously now with that peace of mind. Awesome. So I bet with the amount that goes into this, must cost a fortune.
Not necessarily. It is an investment, and it depends. There's so much that goes into it that it's hard to just say, oh, this is what it will cost and this is what a trust costs. The things that are important to think about are whether or not you're going to be paying an estate tax. So are we going to be doing any tax planning? How important is the asset protection piece to you? How simple or complex is your family unit? So if you have a blended family, there's a lot more considerations, and the estate plan itself is just going to be a lot longer. So all of these things, including what you want as out of your will. Some people really just want something simple, and that obviously is going to be a lot less. But I would say a ballpark range. I might get in trouble with other attorneys for giving a ballpark range, but
yeah,
I would expect.
I think that it's safe to say that it's not over $5,000.
Yeah, it can be, but that would be right? The higher end of most people.
Gotcha. Yeah. So most of it can get done for under that. Awesome. So how do people get a hold of you, Ann, if they're interested in learning more?
They can call my office at 206-487-1245, or they can email me at Ann, A-N-N, at BryantLawPLLC.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure. It's great working with you so far. We were having a great time yesterday answering those morbid questions about what happens when I'm disabled. But no, it's always, we always face it differently. And there is a recent tragedy in my life, and it made it that much more important to make sure that we don't leave our families unprepared in the event, God forbid, that something should happen. So thank you very much for your time, Ann.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.